Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of Howard University Law School and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I started my career, said, for example, of Black lawyers, unless you are a social architect, you are a social parasite. And I feel it's the same way with intellectuals who just want to complain and like diagnose problems and are not willing to really invest themselves or even have the courage to really pursue a solution. You know, you see it with the mess that's been created in our cities by just putting out, this notion, defund the police, without putting out, and then what? Like really, and then what?
Well, Ben Jealous, you just opened up a whole can of worms.
Oh, I mean, here. I'll go there. Like,
let's do it. Here we go. Because the abolitionists will say they have plenty of plans and scholarship about what this looks like. There was
how do you call yourself an abolitionist these days? Honestly, if you've never abolished anything, like I've led successful campaigns to abolish the death penalty in multiple states and one, and the juvenile death penalty as a whole. I know what it takes to abolish something. These people call themselves abolitionists, and they disgrace the notion even of anti-slavery abolitionists because they don't actually have a vision, a practical vision for what replaces it.
Have you not been following, let's say, the ballot measure, I believe it was in Minnesota, that got like 43% of the vote? I mean, like people poo-pooed that as a real loss, but almost 50% of a community.
I mean, we were supporting it. I mean, here's the thing. This is what I'm talking about. Have you ever read James Foreman Jr.'s book, Locking Up Our Own?
No.
Okay, so what that's about is why it is that not just Joe Biden, George Bush, Bill Clinton supported mass incarceration, not just why Charlie Rangel, Maxine Waters supported mass incarceration, but ultimately how it was that all those folks felt compelled to support it because older Black women en masse supported it and older Black men en masse supported it because they were scared. And what happens with crime survivors in neighborhoods that are high crime areas, turns out they just say yes to everything. Like if you poll them and you say, you know what, should every inmate get a college education? They would say yes. Why? Because they're coming back to their neighborhood and they want them to come back with better job prospects than they had when they left. Should we just lock them all up like tomorrow? Anybody on the street doing anything, 2 rocks of crack, get you 5 years. Yes. And so having spent 30 years of my life in the fight to stop police violence, it terrified me when I saw the slogan, defund the police, because I knew they would do what it's done, which is to frankly scare a lot of old Black folks and push them to the right. And so what do we see, right? We see, police endorsed folks taking out our most progressive mayors. Right? You get Eric Adams, you don't get Maya Wiley.
Wait a minute. Ben Jealous, do you think that that Eric Adams won and Maya Wiley lost because of defund the police and not because Scott Stringer, who was the left candidate in the lead, was succumbed to a Me Too scandal that ultimately didn't amount to much to anything, but the left immediately turned tail and abandoned him. There was a failure to coalesce around an alternative candidate until the 11th hour. Dianne Morales' campaign, who was potentially the other left insurgent, got taken down by her own internal mishigas and on and on and on. Like, I don't know that you can lay blame for Eric Adams' success on the slogan, defund the police, especially when none of the candidates ran a defund the police platform, none of them. And all of them had very similar, the plurality of the at least more liberal candidates had a very similar stance on how much they wanted to decrease police funding in New York. They all just said like $1 million. Like they all said the same thing.
Except I would say this, you have to look at the posture of the candidates and you have to look at the impact that it had on pushing people towards more centrist candidates. You can look at the opinion polls. Right after George Floyd, there was massive consensus to really move quickly to stop police violence. And then you can look at the impact that defund the police had on pushing people back towards the center and the right.
Finn, that is not my recollection of what happened. My recollection of what happened is that you're correct that after George Floyd's murder went viral, there was a lot of public consensus around sympathy for protests, sympathies for even some property damage style protests, and defund the police as a slogan was polling at around 40%, which was pretty high. Subsequently, Joe Biden pit the idea of protesting and defund against the idea that he would be reelected and be able to beat Trump. And suddenly voters had to choose between solidarity with these protests, which they were told by a 24-hour news cycle on MSNBC and CNN was going to hurt Joe Biden's chances, and getting Trump out of office. And over the course of Joe Biden antagonizing the slogan and Don Lemon and everybody else getting on TV and saying how bad the slogan was, of course, public opinion of the slogan went down.
No, I don't think that Joe Biden drove that at all. When you look as somebody,
Joe Biden, who came out today after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict and crossed his arms and said, the jury system works in America.
Totally wacky. Yeah, like severely problematic. Just like it was problematic when Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden is a blue dog Democrat, and he's gonna be a blue dog Democrat, and his sensibilities are out of touch often with history. He's made two very problematic historical statements on two issues I spent my whole life working on in the last 6 months. One was today about juries, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, does this man even understand the history of lynchings and everything else in our society? That like juries do a good job or whatever the heck he said. Crazy. The other thing was back in August when he was really buttonholed at a CNN town hall meeting about voter suppression laws and the need for a strong federal response. And he said, literally, you just can't stop the people from voting. So yes, Joe Biden makes problematic statements, but what I'm telling you is a guy who goes to church in the poorest zip code in Baltimore, my family's gone to church for 85 years, with a whole bunch of little old ladies, is that defund the police, when it hit the pews of that church in Sandtown, Baltimore, right, Harlem Park, Baltimore, they were terribly confused. They were so ready to follow young activists. They also are so afraid of bullets flying to the neighborhood, of home invasions, of carjackings, that you cannot give people half a solution. You've got to give them a whole solution.
But if people are so confused, why isn't there more narrative work being done to explain that defund the police does not mean, and abolitionists have never argued that it means we do lawlessness and just a libertarian gun show, every man for themselves, in the streets nonsense, that we're talking about the fact that police budgets have swelled over the course of the last decades with absolutely no correlation to a decrease in crime, and that people who are concerned about crime shouldn't be trying to address that concern by throwing more money at the police, that all that's doing is getting police driving military-style tanks through their neighborhood and absolutely no decrease in the social problems that they're identifying. And that if they want less crime in their neighborhoods, they should want to shift that funding from the police to anti-poverty measures, which are correlated with the rise of crime. Right? Like that is the conversation we should be having.
Message discipline, right?
Right, it is. But we endlessly have a conversation about whether or not defund the police is a good slogan, using a lot of words and oxygen and energy that could be telling those afraid older voters that defund is actually a safety mechanism. And funding the police does not make you safer.
Or we could just use a slogan that's literally not going to cut us off at the knees, which is what the civil rights community has had good discipline doing for like most of its hundreds of years. But, occasionally we make mistakes like any movement does. I would say this one is a mistake. And what we've done at People for the American Way, what our young elected officials have done, what our African-American Ministers Leadership Conference has done, is to actually go out there. And we did this in the midst of this because we were terrified by the impact. Mayor Savante Myrick, who's on our team, he replaced Andrew Gillum, who had been on People's Force staff for 17 years, all the time he was mayor, before he ran, and city council, and before that, up until he ran for governor. Has introduced a package up in a legislative package up in Ithaca, New York. And the reason you might say, oh, it's a little college town. The reason why college towns are so important is because when you're trying to transform criminal justice policy, college towns are where you want to start because they're the most comfortable with experimenting. So, for example, the Ban the Box movement, which I played a big part in, while I was president of the NAACP. And when I was a foundation president before that, we started with college towns for that reason. And eventually we had Walmart in the state of California, making it easier to employ formerly incarcerated people. But you got to start somewhere. So the laboratory, when it's bottom up, it's college towns. And what do we put forward? We put forward that you have a public safety department, not a police department. That you have a civilian head, not a law enforcement head. That you have two divisions. One is, police officers. One is armed. The other one is social workers. And then over time, you replace about half of the police with social workers through attrition.
But that's just defund. That is defund.
That's a solution.
You don't have to call it
half an idea. It's half an idea.
It's not. But Ben,
come on, it's half an idea. Defund and what?
There are abolitionists who've been writing in detail for decades about what defunding the police actually looks like. And exactly what you're describing is what they're advocating for.
But
now,
again,
if you want to call it something else, I don't really care.
But you should care, is my point.
No.
You should, just like you should care that Dr. King, right, said, let's put Rosa Parks on the bus and not just take anybody who's having a problem on the bus.
Well, no. Here's the thing. I did not bring defund up in this conversation.
I know I did.
You did. So I am very happy moving through the world, avoiding subjects, avoiding language that I think is not going to work for my audience. What I do not do is use my platform to heap on antagonism to phrases that don't matter.
Family, right? This is a family podcast, right? This podcast, I can't imagine like as many, I don't know, Southern like police chiefs listening to your podcast.
No, but there are a lot of libertarians that listen to this podcast. There are a lot of people across the political spectrum because they perceive me to be a fair dealer,
smart,
right?
incisive,
and the reality
honest,
is,
which is why I'm here. And I'm just saying, let's be honest within the broad range of folks. Look, criminal justice, I've worked criminal justice reform with all those folks you've mentioned, libertarians, Christian conservatives, fiscal conservatives, in addition to, the left of the left of the left, right? And everybody with a hole for the moderates who tend to be addicted when they're in office to like prison industrial complex money. So I don't mess with them on criminal justice reform because they will tie you up all day long. But all I'm saying is when you want to abolish something, you got to be able to say like defund and.
Well, the defund movie is doing that. And I hope that next time you are on TV and have the kind of platform that I am not afforded, and someone says defund is a bad slogan, you would suggest to them that poll numbers aren't telling the same story. Joe Biden also got his advocacy for fracking caused support for banning fracking to decline by 20 percentage points. Now, did fracking suddenly become a good idea because Joe Biden was like, fracking is good, and over the course of like 4 or 5 months convinced an additional 20% of Americans that we had to frack? No. But people who are in respected positions of power, spending their time and energy maligning ideas, slogans, whatever it is, will affect poll numbers. And so I'm just unconscious of that, as well as I think I can be honest about the fact that, of course, there are some people who are going to be hesitant about defund. But my job as a communicator, I think, is not to poo-poo the idea or to say that it's not a well-thought-out idea, because it very much is. And the extreme slogan is abolish the police. Defund is the compromise. And Republicans...
That's a distinction without a difference. When you're, a working class Black grandmother at my church in Sandtown, they just simply want to know, well, what are you going to replace it with?
And then I would answer. And I would answer.
But it can't be long. It's got to be as short as defund the police.
You just sat here when you were explaining your program in Ithaca, used a lot of words to explain your version of. That's literally all you have to say.
So what we would say is half of modern police work is social work, and therefore half the department should be social workers.
Ben, that's literally what these defund people are saying, and I have to believe that you know that.
They're talking like academics, not like organizers. I'm an organizer.
But they're not. There's plenty of organizers who are out there who have been doing this work for a really long time.
But what I'm saying is that if you're actually working as an organizer and you're focused on a solution, what you run into is you better start talking about your solution. And so defund the police, and to me, an organizer is somebody who actually gets things. A lot of people who call themselves organizers who only lose, right?
Ben, come on. No, that is not fair.
Win, right. When you win, it is fair because there better be a high bar. There's a high bar for me as a young organizer, right? And so, and I want them to win. And I'm working with them every day, and we're actually got something passed. that is now moved through. And we got unanimous support. And we got unanimous support by organizing Black folks and white folks and bombarding that city council with common sense. But we had to talk to them about what we were for. And so you can't just talk about what you're against. It's a real simple rhetorical point that you can talk about problem, you better talk about the solution too. That's it.
That's fine. And the defund people, when given an opportunity to actually defend themselves on TV, instead of just having millionaires like Don Lemon sit around with their arms crossed, people who have never had to experience living in a crime-ridden environment, or to have as direct exposure to the kind of police surveillance and oppression that folks who, like myself and my siblings, grew up in New York.
No matter how rich they are, has had to deal with police surveillance. I mean, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did.
Yeah, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did. Why don't you remind Don Lemon and the rest of them who were so quick to turn the tides? The point that you made earlier about this identity, wait a minute, this point that you made earlier about the identity of interest between being told that white affluent liberals represent the interests of working class people, it's also a lot of Black affluent liberals who are told that they represent the interest of Black people. And I would argue too, there are a lot of people who are representing and providing cover for not just antagonism of certain political realities, but for entire political campaigns, who paved the way for someone like Joe Biden to pave the way for Joe, juries are just doing their job, it's a great system, Biden, Jim Crow Joe, to be the obstructionist that he is being today. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.